Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any exciting bookish things that have gone on during the week. I only have a couple of logistical things to talk about before we get to the Friday Reads portion of the video. I finished 2 books this week. We'll talk about them. So I'm not going to do a timestamp down below to skip to the Friday Reads because everything should be pretty quick to get to that. I just want to let you know what's going on next week and how it might impact the channel and everything that's going on today. So, obviously, if you follow along closely, you know I didn't manage to post a video this week. That is entirely because I have been busy with work, and when I haven't been busy with work, I have been preparing my Pulitzer Prize predictions for this year. And I'm so close to having that done. I am being really thorough. And I think what I'm going to do this year is I'm going to try to make the video a little shorter and have a lot of the details in a post on my website or blog, whatever you want to call it. And that'll just make it easier to film. Because last year's predictions video was an hour long. And I'm trying to think about how to shorten it, but still include the amount of detail. So that'll probably be a solution. Anyway, my whole week has been devoted to that. And it's actually been a good week, not to like sidetrack everything, but if you follow along closely, you know I have been dealing with a lot of anxiety stuff that has been sort of building up and up and up since 2020. And since November, it has become a whole thing that I'm trying to deal with and manage so I can get through the day and the week and all of that stuff. And so far in 2025, I have not been very successful at focusing on a task and seeing it through to completion. That's why I haven't done my video in defense of The Catcher in the Rye yet. So basically, it's a good sign to me that I have been able to focus on this. And unfortunately, basically, it feels like I can really focus on one thing, and that's an improvement. I'm hoping to get to the point where I can focus on more things, and we'll get there. We'll get there, baby steps. But I'm feeling good about that. So now, today, I'm filming this on Friday, March 21st, and I am filming this, obviously, which will be posted on Saturday as usual. And I'm hoping that I can finish that last little bit of the Pulitzer predictions and film it today. It's going to be tight, but I'm going to try to do it. So hopefully I will have that filmed. And if I can get it filmed today in time to edit it, so I should really stop talking, I will try to schedule it for Sunday. If I can't get it filmed and edited, I will have to do it either Monday or Tuesday. I can't do it on Wednesday. So basically, the reason I'm doing these hurdles to try to figure out filming, editing, and posting, even if it's going to end up being next week, is that Joel and I are going to be in Seattle next week. He has to go for work, and I work from home, so I can work from the hotel. And really, it's the only reason I would be going with him is that we have a new godson who lives outside of Seattle. And if I go with Joel, we can both meet the baby, who, by the way, is named after Joel. So that's a lot of fun. So that I'm going to be in a hotel room next week. So I already have my book haul filmed. I did manage to do that this week. So I'm going to have that to schedule for later. I will have to film at least one video from the hotel room because on Wednesday we get the Women's Prize for Nonfiction shortlist, and I'm hoping to do a reaction to that from the hotel. But if as much as I can film in advance, it'll be great. So that's the logistics to look forward to. And I will try to film a Friday Reads video. Friday is going to be a little tight because I have a work day as usual, but that's also the day we need to get in the car and drive out to where our new godson lives. And I will need to have the Friday Reads film. Maybe I'll film it on Thursday, if nothing else. But I'll try to figure it out so that there will be a Friday Reads. If time gets away from me or it becomes too tight, I'll try to post something and give you a heads up that it might not be coming. And if you don't see a Friday Reads, that is entirely why. I can guarantee it. But I will try. So those are the logistics. Let's get into the actual Friday Reads portion of the video. I finished 2 books this week, and they are the 2 books that I had begun working on in my last Friday Reads video. Let's talk about the one that I finished first, which is the one I was listening to on audio. It is The Dutch House by Ann Patchett. And I really liked this. This is Greg bait all the way. It's got siblings. It's got complicated family histories. It's got people interrogating the past. It's like a checklist of things that really interest me as a reader and immediately catch my attention. So you can imagine I absolutely loved this book. And the audio is great. Tom Hanks does a great job with the narration. And there is still that little weird thing where he says the chapters in an offbeat way, and it can kind of throw you for a second. Like, I'm trying to remember an example. I don't remember which chapter it was, but there was one where he was like, chapter 18, and then started speaking normally again. So that was interesting, but he does a great job with this story. So if you are unfamiliar, this was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It lost to The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. And it is about 2 siblings, a brother and a sister. And this is actually the sister. I did not know this before I picked the book up, but this painting that is on the cover was commissioned for this book. So in the book, there is a portrait of the sister wearing a red coat in front of roses and blue swallow wallpaper. And so it's just so fun to know the story behind the cover and that it reflects what's inside the book so perfectly. So that is just really cool. Anyway, the sister is Maeve. The brother is Danny. And Anne is, I think, 8 years older than Danny, maybe 7. And when Danny is very young, their mother leaves. They live in the Dutch house of the title. It's this very ornate, elaborate, unique old home that was built by a Dutch family named the Van Hoebeeks. And it is sort of part of Maeve and Danny's identity and their father's identity. But their mother didn't like the house. And so things sort of tease out along the way about details of their mother, because, as I said, Danny was very young when she left, so he doesn't really remember her all that well. But Maeve does, and there is even that sort of tension that lies between the siblings, because Maeve remembers their mother, loves their mother, wants her to come back. Danny is indifferent. He doesn't have the experience of her that Maeve has, and that is something that I have always found very interesting, how siblings can ostensibly grow up in the same situation and come away with different attachments, different reactions, different feelings about how they grew up. And sometimes that's due to age difference. That's really what does it here in this book. And sometimes it's just due to impression, or maybe you just didn't see something. It's definitely something I have experienced with my siblings. It's something that my mother has definitely experienced with her siblings, because my mother is the oldest of 5, and there's a huge age gap between the 5 kids. Like, she was 19 or 20 when her youngest brother was born. So they have very different experiences of their childhood because of where they were at financially and economically when my mother was born, and also just the nature of the family. When my mother was born, my great-grandmother didn't live with them. And by the time some of the other kids came around, she did. So there was a lot more reliable childcare in the house. Anyway, I'm going all over the place with this, but just to say, it really taps into a lot of stuff that I find very interesting in family dynamics, and it feels very true. And Ann Patchett is such a subtle but sharp writer, and I really admire that talent. It came out beautifully in Tom Lake as well. I will say the first book of hers that I read was Run. And I was not so enthusiastic about that book. I didn't really like it. I feel like it kind of felt a little bit stagey. like you can kind of see it adapted to Broadway because there's a lot of like people talking in a room and everybody will leave and one person will get a monologue and things like that. And also the plot, we don't need to get into it. I didn't like that book. So I stayed away from Ann Patchett for a long time. Tom Lake is the book that got me back into the fold, and I'm glad that I did. And I think Bel Canto, which is one of her earlier books, I appreciate it. I like it. I don't feel any strong attraction to it, though. So I think I'm a fan of where she is in the more recent past as a writer. And I can see, looking at Bel Canto, the talent that she had and how she has honed it over time. And it really shows in The Dutch House. I have to think about it a little bit, but I might revise my Pulitzer thinking because I think I might have voted for this over The Nickel Boys to win the Pulitzer that year. So that doesn't mean anything here, but it is something I have been thinking about because I really think, and this was so close, it was like at the finish line. It was a finalist. And I understand why the Nickel Boys won. I haven't done a video about that yet, but at some point. And it's just, I feel like this would have been a great win for Ann Patchett. And also because I loved the book. So there it is. The narrative and the timeline of the narrative unfold in a very interesting way that with any other author could have been confusing because the timeline moves like a wave. You know, you begin here when Danny and Maeve are children, and then you sort of push out into the future or closer to the present, I guess. And although I don't think it ever really gets to the present. So you start here and you push out and then it comes back. And the point at which it's almost like the tide coming in because you never really go back to where you had been. You come back a little further and then a little further. And then you push out and get some details about where things go. And then it comes back. And it's really interesting how she does that and does not make it confusing at all. It's just this sort of unraveling of details and directions about what is happening and where things are going in the future. And I really loved the way she did that. I just think this is such a great book. I absolutely love it. I'm happy I have a hardcover of it because I have been collecting Ann Patchett's books in hardcover form. And actually, is this a first edition? It is a first edition. So that's pretty cool too. I just love this book. And I think spoiler for the book haul that you will see next week. Actually, no, you'll see it in April because I had already filmed it by the time I went to my local used bookstore this week. I found a copy of These Precious Days in hardcover there, so I brought it home. So I am kind of stuck trying to decide if I want to read Commonwealth next or These Precious Days. It could really go either way. So we'll see. But I'm just so glad I'm catching up to Ann Patchett. And this was a really beautiful book. And as I said last week, the dynamic between Danny and Maeve does remind me a lot of my sister. It's different, but the setup is very similar because, you know, since there's so much instability in their home, Maeve is sort of like a mother figure to Danny. And she is quite literally the most important person in his life for about the first 20 to 25 years of his life. And they have this very strong bond to each other because... So I've mentioned in the past that from the books I had read of Ann Patchett's so far, I have this running theory that her books are set in states of suspension, of ordinary life or ordinary time. This one pushes that definition the hardest, but I still think it kind of applies. So in Run, the first book of hers that I read, the suspension is that there is a car accident and the story unfolds as people are waiting to find out whether or not someone is going to survive that car accident. So there's a sort of suspension of normal life while they wait to find out what's going to happen next. Bel Canto, there is a hostage crisis that lasts a long time. And the suspension is that the people who are in this house, both the hostages and the hostage takers, are not living by the normal rules of society. There's a sort of almost dreamlike world that they are living in while they're in this space. Tom Lake, it is due to the pandemic. due to the pandemic, the daughters of the woman who is the narrator of the story have come home, and it is they for the first time since they grew up, everybody's back under one roof, living for a suspended period of time, and it has that sense you don't know how long it's going to last like this. Is it going to be the last time they're all together like this? If they are together again, it could be different because one of the girls is probably going to get married soon and everything will change. So suspended life basically seems to be something that Ann Patchett keeps coming back to. And in this book, the problem is it's not a finite notion of time. I think you could make a case that Danny and Maeve are not living, like their whole lives are that sort of interrupted life, because they don't live a life that a lot of people understand. They grew up in this weird, elaborate house that to them felt normal, but to other people feels really fancy and like a museum, and it's unreal to them. They grew up without a mother. They have a father who is really emotionally distant, and they didn't talk about the past and all of that stuff. So they almost have to dig and find things out later. And they grow up in a sort of bubble where it's just Danny and Maeve. And then they have to figure out how to adapt to the rest of the world over the course of the book. So it definitely pushes the boundary of my theory of Ann Patchett, but I still think it kind of applies. And it will be interesting to see if that holds up as I read more of her fiction in the future. But for now, I think it's still intact. Although, as I said, this one did sort of stretch the boundary of that theory. So I loved this book, and I can't wait to read more Ann Patchett in the future. The next book I finished just this morning, in fact, was Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks. You may remember when I talked to you last week, I mentioned that because I had just read Memorial Days, which is Geraldine Brooks' memoir, I had been having a really difficult time settling on which book I wanted to read in print. I spent a couple of days like doing a thing that I do. Sometimes when I don't have an idea what I want to read or I don't know what I'm in the mood for, I will accumulate like a pile of 4 to 6 books and spend a little time with each one trying to test the water, like read a couple of pages and see if it's something that I want to pick up. And often, if this ends up going on for days, which was the case at that time, I shuffle a couple of books in and out, like say, okay, well, I'm definitely not in the mood for this. What about this one? And substitute some in. On the last day of that process, I substituted in Year of Wonders. And then I had a FaceTime with my sister, and she saw the book and gasped and said that she loves it. So I started reading a couple of pages and I was hooked. So I finished it this week. So I've been on a Geraldine Brooks journey in the month of March. And which is funny because the next book of hers that I will do is a reread of March, which is the book that won her the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And this is a really beautiful book, and sort of similar to what I said about Ann Patchett, it is also a very subtle book. There's a lot of work here that makes it seem like this is a sort of simple story, and yet there is a lot of craft and time and thought that went into crafting every single paragraph and then using each paragraph to make a whole chapter. And it's just so well done for the most part. And I will also say this is a very heavy book. It might not be for everyone because Year of Wonders is, as it says right here, a novel of the plague. It is set in a small English village inspired by the real town of Eyam, which experienced the plague. And what they did when they started having cases of the plague pop up, they did this very unusual and remarkable thing. They closed their borders and decided to cloister themselves in the town limits. And no one was allowed to come in, and everybody agreed not to leave the boundaries of the town in order to make sure that the contagion didn't spread to other neighboring villages. It's an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice and kindness on the part of these townspeople, because as a result of them agreeing not to leave, a lot more people in the town are exposed to the plague than might have otherwise. Like if they had fled they might have lived. And what ends up happening is that 2/3 of the population in this town die. And there's a very interesting afterword where Geraldine Brooks talks about the research and how she went about writing a story that is true to the nature of what happened, while also trying to fill in the gaps, because this is set in 1665 and 1666. And there are not great records of what actually happened in the town. You know the broad strokes, but not a lot of details. And some of those are anecdotal things that work their way into the book. And with different characters. And she will explain how in some cases she used real names of townspeople, but only when she wasn't deviating from the facts of their life, which I really do appreciate. And as the contagion worsens, as people die on almost every page of this book, it could be very heavy. And it is, but it's not burdensome, if that makes sense. And it could be sort of mawkish and sentimental or maudlin in its portrayal of these events. It could feel kind of melodramatic. And for most of the book, it doesn't, which is absolutely remarkable and a true measure of talent, I think. And it makes it even more interesting that I read this for the first time after reading Memorial, which is Geraldine Brooks's memoir about her life with her husband, Tony Horwitz, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And she's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And in Memorial, she talks about how when they settled down in a town in Virginia, she had to give up her reporting career. She had a reporting career just like Tony Horwitz did, where they traveled around to like Bosnia and places that were kind of dangerous. So she, at a certain point, gave that up to be at home and be a stable presence for her children. And Tony is the person who recommended that she write fiction. And she talked in Memorial about how she and Tony would always collaborate on each other's work and edit each other. And she said he was a particularly ruthless editor. And in Memorial, she says he would strike out any word that you don't even know you repeat, but you do. And he also was ruthless about preventing it from getting overly sentimental or melodramatic. And you really see that in this book, how obviously she is the crafter of this story, but you can see the collaboration that she talks about in Memorial Days at work. And it makes it even more poignant that this book is dedicated to him. For Tony, without you, I never would have gone there. And that really does make this particularly powerful, having just read Memorial Days. I think I keep calling it Memorial. It's Memorial Days by Geraldine Brooks. So I loved most of this book. It is 308 pages if you include that afterward. And, you know, if you get in there, I would honestly recommend that you read that afterward. Yes, it is 308 pages because it has great content about how she approached telling this story. The last 50 pages became a bit melodramatic for me. All of a sudden, there are, and I don't want to spoil anything for you, but like there's a lot that happens. And when I finished the book, I don't think I fully appreciated just how much and how melodramatic it was. And then Joel came in the room. By the way, Teddy is off on an adventure with Joel right now. That's why he's not here right now. And then he came in and he asked how the book was. And, you know, I had mentioned, it's like, I feel like it got a little dramatic in the last 50 pages, but I still really like it. And then he said, well, you know, I don't know that I would get around to reading it anytime soon. So what happens? And I explained all of the things that happened in the last 50 pages. And he was like, oh my God, that sounds like a lot. I was like, it actually is. So it's a little disappointing that such a restrained and subtly beautiful book becomes so dramatic and takes sort of twists and turns in the last 50 pages that I don't think it needed to. But I still really like the book. I think the most disappointing thing is that this was cruising to a 5-star rating for me. And when I rated it this morning, I gave it a 4.5. So it dropped like a full half star for those last 50 pages. I would still take this journey again. I would still recommend that you read this book. Who knows, you might like that a little more than I did. And in thinking about it, since I finished it this morning, I don't know how you would wrap up this story. I mean, I can think of some ways, so maybe that's not fair. But it probably was bound to have, especially as you start wrapping up the story, it was bound to have some semblance of drama to it. And it's just, it's interesting. I still really like the book a lot. It has very interesting, subtle, again, debates about crises of faith and compassion. It is a book that is very much about the enormous capacity we as humans have for kindness and the enormous capacity we as humans have for cruelty, and how those things can often live side by side within one person. Or one person can be just on the edge of becoming a cruel person, and the forces that might push them over the edge in that direction. I left my bookmark in on a page that had a quote that I think really beautifully sums this up. If I can just find it. Okay, despair is a cavern beneath our feet, and we teeter on its very brink. And that's what the book is about, but it's also using this to talk about humanity in general. Like, you can apply that lesson to so many things. And to someone living today and reading this book, it has a particular poignance because we lived through a plague of our own. And even just the turmoil of politics over the last 10 years, not just in the United States, but in a lot of places in the world, it does feel particularly resonant again. Like, this is a book that is set in 1665 and 1666. And the things that it is grappling with, the big questions about life and humanity, still apply today. We are still struggling with a lot of the same things. And I think that's, to make it so specific and yet so timeless, is another really beautiful, genius thing that Geraldine Brooks has achieved here. So pretty monumental, I would say. And yes, it does get particular poignancy because, this was published in 2001. She would have had no idea that 19 years later we would have a plague of our own. And it holds up. And it's really interesting to see the journeys that these people in the town go on as they survive and die, and all framed through Anna, who is a housekeeper who kind of gets pushed into the role of healer and discovers questions about her faith and her certainty about the world, and also discovers her own power as a person. And I liked it. I am really excited to reread March. So more about Geraldine Brooks in the future. So what am I going to read next? I haven't really decided because we're going to be in Seattle next week, and I will probably take a physical book with me. I have not decided what that book is. I have 3 books from the library at the moment, and 2 of them I was able to push back their due date, so they're not due until April 18th. So I have time. I don't need to worry about those. The other one is a new release, so it is due back earlier than that. I can't remember the date. So I might take that library book so I can cross it off my list and return it when we get home. But I feel like I've been doing all this work on Geraldine Brooks in particular for a Pulitzer deep dive. So part of me is thinking that I should take March by Geraldine Brooks. And then part of me is also thinking, because I love to make things complicated. Well, I love to make things complicated because I like to be thorough, is what I tell myself. I'm also thinking that one of the Pulitzer finalists the year that March won is a book called The March by E.L. Doctorow. So maybe I should bring that book and read it while we are traveling. And part of me is also thinking, I'm going to be working during the day. It's not a vacation. And in the evening, we're probably going to be going out on the town and getting dinner and seeing friends. So I might not even have time to read. So maybe I shouldn't take something that's part of a project. So I don't know. I haven't decided yet. What I do know is that, well, I haven't picked my next audiobook, but in the car on the way to Seattle, Joel and I have already downloaded the audio of Kate and Frida by Kim Fay. We had access to the audio. I was also sent this copy by Putnam, which is very kind of them. But we also had access to the audio. And we did Love and Saffron, Kim Fay's previous book, on audio back to back. I listened to it first when we were in Italy. Did you know we went to Italy? And then Joel listened to it immediately because I had enjoyed it so much. So we decided we wanted to try to find a time when we could do this together. So we needed a road trip. And lo and behold, this Seattle trip came up. Joel's job just asked him to go to Seattle like a week ago. So it ended up happening very quickly. But so we will be reading this or listening to this on the way to Seattle. And then everything else is up in the air. We'll see what happens. I would love to hear what you have been reading, what you've been up to, watching, loving, and all of that stuff in the comment section down below. And thank you for your patience this week and next as I, work on some projects, exciting things that will be coming to the channel, including my Pulitzer Prize predictions. At the time I'm filming this, I don't know when you will get them, but you will get them next week. Whether I have to film them in a hotel room or not remains to be seen. So stay tuned. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.